He told me the Saturday morning meetings were mandatory, that the project manager had started scheduling them once a month, because the site crews couldn't make weekdays work. Then I found the bus ticket in the inside pocket of his winter coat, folded in half and already worn at the crease, like he'd taken it out and put it back more than once. The destination was Dunmore Falls. I had never heard of it. It was a Tuesday evening in November when I found it. My husband had asked me to grab his coat from the front closet, because he'd left his phone in the pocket, and he had his hands full draining pasta. I handed him the coat. I kept the ticket. Not because I'd planned to, more because my hands simply didn't let go of it. I set it on the windowsill behind the kitchen curtain. I sat down. I ate the dinner he had made, a chicken and barley soup he'd had simmering since 4 in the afternoon because he knew I'd had a long shift and would be too tired to think about food. And I said nothing. Not that night. My name is Freya. I'm 34 years old. I work as a registered nurse at a hospital in Hamilton, Ontario, in the cardiac step-down unit, which means I spend most of my shifts watching for the moment when something that seems stable stops being stable. I tell you this because it's probably relevant that I am professionally trained to notice when something doesn't fit. The ticket was dated 3 weeks earlier, a Saturday. The same Saturday my husband had told me he was at a site review in Stony Creek, 20 minutes from our house. Not a 90-minute bus ride to a town I had to look up on a map just to confirm it existed. Dunmore Falls, population just under 4,000, one main street, a marina that closes in October, a Legion Hall, and a hardware store. And, according to Google Maps, a long-term care facility called Mapleview Lodge on County Road 7 just past the grain elevator. I don't know why my eyes stopped on the care home. Maybe some part of me had already decided that whatever my husband was doing, it wasn't what it looked like. Or maybe I wanted it not to be, which is a different thing entirely, and probably more honest. Either way, I closed the browser and went to bed, and I said nothing to him that night, and nothing the night after that. We've been together for 11 years. We met when I was finishing my second year of nursing school, and he was finishing a construction management certificate at Mohawk. We were married on a Saturday in September at a conservation area outside the city, on a day that was supposed to be sunny and turned out overcast and cool. I still think of it as one of the most beautiful days of my life. My father walked me down a gravel path lined with goldenrod in his good shoes with his arm linked through mine, and when he handed me off, he squeezed my hand once and didn't say a word. That was exactly what my father would do. It was exactly enough. My father died 6 years ago. A cardiac event, which is the clinical term for his heart stopping and not starting again, and for me being 2 provinces away on a long weekend when it happened. I was a cardiac nurse and I was somewhere else. I've never found a way to finish processing that particular fact. I've just learned to set it down on a high shelf and not look at it too often. What I'll tell you is that my father was not a man who showed his hand. Not cold, exactly. He showed up, he was at the school concerts, the graduation, the wedding, the holidays. But there was always something held back. A glass between him and the feeling, and no matter how long I stood on the other side of it, the glass didn't come down. I spent a long time as a child, and then a longer time as an adult, wondering whether I was the reason for that distance or simply a person who lived on the wrong side of it. After he died, my mother told me it had been the same for her, that she'd loved him completely for 40 years, while wondering quietly and without bitterness whether that love had ever fully landed on the other shore. She said it the way you'd describe a summer that was mostly warm, but had too many cloudy weeks. Not ruined, just not entirely what you'd hoped for. I'm telling you all of this because what happened in Dunmore Falls had almost nothing to do with suspicion, and almost everything to do with my father. A father I thought I had finished grieving until I hadn't. I checked our joint account 2 days after finding the ticket. We bank with RBC, joint checking, both our names full access. In the 14 months prior, I found 7 transactions at Mapleview Lodge in Dunmore Falls. The amounts were small, sometimes $12, sometimes $8, once $23. The kind of money you spend on something from a gift shop. A card, a tin of shortbread, a poinsettia at Christmas. They'd started in September of the previous year, recurring every 6 to 8 weeks, without any pattern I could map onto the official story of our weekends. He had told me he was somewhere else on every single one of those days. I want to say I handled it with the clinical detachment I bring to difficult shifts. I did not. I sat in my car in the hospital parkade at the end of a 12-hour day, still in my scrubs, and I cried with an intensity I hadn't felt since the week after my father's funeral. Not from grief exactly, From the particular ache of discovering that someone you believe you know completely may be living a small secret life that you've had no access to. I didn't hire an investigator. It wasn't a decision I'd thought through. I just knew that I needed to see for myself, because whatever I found, I was going to need to have been the one who found it. So I waited. I've always been good at waiting. I work in a unit where waiting is a clinical skill. 6 weeks after finding the ticket, on a Saturday morning in January, when the temperature had dropped to -14, and the streets had that particular Hamilton winter silence, where even the traffic sounds muffled, my husband told me the team meeting was back on, and that he'd probably be home by 2. I was already dressed. I had swapped my shift 2 days before. I followed him to the downtown bus terminal on Hunter Street, and watched him board the 8:15 to Dunmore Falls. I bought a ticket for the same route at the automated kiosk and sat 4 rows behind him. He put in his earbuds. He watched the highway unreal in the gray January light. He looked from behind, exactly like a man who was on his way to do something he hadn't told his wife about, and nothing in his posture gave me any indication of what that thing was. We got off in Dunmore Falls at 9:47. I stayed a half block behind him through the cold, which at that point had a wind component that made it feel like a personal grievance. He walked with the ease of someone who knew the route. He didn't check his phone for directions. He signed in at the front desk of Mapleview Lodge without pausing to look at the directory board, turned left down a corridor, and knocked on a door at the end of the hall. I stood outside in the parking lot long enough that my ears started burning. Then I went in. The woman at the front desk asked if I was visiting someone. I said I was looking for my husband. She pointed me toward the left corridor without hesitation, which meant she knew him, which was its own kind of confirmation. The door at the end of the hall was partway open. I could hear his voice, lower than usual, careful, and underneath it a woman's voice, slow and a little graveled and warm. I stood in the hallway, the way I used to stand outside my father's study as a child, listening to him on the phone, trying to read a version of him I couldn't see directly. My husband was reading aloud from a notebook. I caught pieces. Something about a drive through the bush in early spring, something about the way certain skies look just before a storm rolls off the lake. Then the woman said, she had his brow ridge, you know, even then, even right away before she'd opened her eyes. And my husband said quietly, I'll make sure she knows that. I pushed the door open. Her name was Agnes Bellamy. She was 81 years old and had been at Mapleview Lodge for 2 years, following a series of small strokes that had left her memory soft in places, intact in others with a clarity that seemed to sharpen sometimes, when she reached for something she'd held on to for a long time. She had white hair cut close, and she was bundled in a blanket despite the room being warm, and when I came through the door, she looked at me with the settled attention of someone who has spent decades watching things arrive that she'd been waiting for. She said, "Oh, you have his eyes." My husband got to his feet so quickly the chair scraped. His face cycled through surprise, then something close to dread, and then an expression I had never seen on him in 11 years. A kind of helpless, undefended relief, like a person who has been holding a breath for a very long time and has just been told they can let it out. He said my name, just the one word. Agnes watched us both with the patient, faintly amused attention of someone who has sat at many bedsides and understands that some conversations need to work themselves out before they can be joined. I asked her who she was. She told me she had been a community midwife for 32 years, that she had worked across northern Ontario for most of that time. Remote communities, fly-in posts, small towns where the nearest hospital was a weather-dependent drive away, and where she had sometimes spent nights in a truck with a bag of supplies and a clear understanding that what needed doing was going to have to be done by her. She had retired to Dunmore Falls to be near her sister. Her sister had since died. Mapleview Lodge had become the next chapter, and she had made her peace with it. She had delivered over 300 babies in her career. She said she remembered most of them. She said this the way someone states the elevation of a mountain, not boastfully, just as a fact about the terrain. She said she remembered me. I was born in a rented house in a community 3 hours north of Timmins, in early March, during weather that closed the roads. My parents had been living there while my father worked a 2-year logging contract, and my mother had gone into labor 5 days before they'd planned to leave for the hospital in town. Agnes had been called. I'd always known the outline of this story. My mother had told it at the kitchen table, the version that had been softened and shaped by 30 years of retelling into something almost funny by the end. A midwife showed up in a snowstorm. Everything worked out. Here you are. I had never known her name. Agnes had known mine for 34 years. She asked me to sit. My husband sat too, farther back, closer to the window, giving me what space I needed without removing himself from the room. That calibration, being present without crowding, is one of the things that made me fall in love with him, and it was still there, even in this. Agnes talked about the night I was born, the details that had been left out of my mother's version. She talked about the particular quality of my mother's fear, focused, disciplined, the fear of someone who understood that steadiness was the only option available. She talked about the house, the smell of wood smoke and pine resin, the way the window above the kitchen sink had begun to lighten by the time it was over. She talked about my father. I had never been able to picture my father at 30. He had always been simply my father, a fixed fact, a constant, and I had not spent much time imagining him before that role was assigned to him. Agnes gave him back to me as a young man who didn't yet know how to be what he was about to become. She said he had stayed near the window for most of it. Not because he was absent, he held my mother's hand, he did what was asked, he did not flinch, but in the spaces between, he stood at the window and looked out at the dark. Agnes had seen in that posture the particular terror of a person who cannot fully absorb what is happening to them and has nowhere to put it. At some point, in the early hours, when the sky was still fully dark and the hardest work was nearly done, he had said something. Not to Agnes, not to anyone in the room, really, more to the window, or to the dark outside it, the way people sometimes speak when they can't speak to a person. Agnes was nearby and she heard it. He said, "I grew up in a house where nobody ever said the thing that mattered. I don't know how to do this any differently. But I'm going to try every day until I figure it out." Agnes had written it in her midwife's journal the same night. She kept detailed records. It was how she processed what she witnessed. She said how she honored the weight of it. She had not written it thinking she would ever give it to anyone. She had written it the way you write something down when you need it to exist, somewhere outside of just yourself. She still had the journal. My husband had found her through a photograph. My mother had come across it while clearing out my father's belongings. A photograph Agnes had taken on the morning after I was born. My parents in their winter coats outside that rented house. My mother holding a bundled newborn with exhausted, joyful eyes. My father standing with his arm around her, squinting into the light. On the back in my father's handwriting. For the woman who kept her nerve when I couldn't. My husband had spent 3 months tracking her down, a retired nurses association, a forwarding address, a phone call to Mapleview Lodge that Agnes's niece had eventually returned. He had gone to meet her on a Saturday in September 14 months earlier, not knowing what he would find, and Agnes had offered him something he wasn't prepared for. She had stories. Her memory for recent things had grown unreliable, but for that night, for the particulars of 34 years ago, held carefully for decades, she was clear. He kept coming back because she kept remembering things, small things. My father asking 2 hours after I arrived whether it was normal for a baby to make that sound, and Agnes telling him yes, and him exhaling for what seemed like the first time all night. My father washing dishes at the kitchen sink at 6 in the morning while my mother slept, for no reason except that he needed something to do with his hands. My father telling Agnes, at the door when she was leaving, that he didn't know how to thank her, and Agnes telling him to just go look at his daughter, which he did, and which was apparently the last thing she saw before she drove back up the road in the pale early light. My husband had been writing all of it down. He had not told me because Agnes's memory was inconsistent, and he hadn't been certain how much he'd be able to collect, and he had not wanted to open something he couldn't finish. He had also been afraid. He said this plainly, without dressing it up, of getting it wrong. Of handing me a half-assembled picture of my father's love, and having it hurt me more than the silence had. He'd wanted to give me something whole, something I could hold without it breaking. I sat with all of this for a long time. Agnes drifted to sleep partway through his explanation, as she sometimes did, just slipped under quietly and resurfaced a few minutes later without acknowledging the gap. I sat in the chair beside her bed and held her hand. It felt like the right thing to do, even though I had known her for less than an hour. When I finally spoke to my husband, I told him I understood why he had kept it, and then I told him that keeping things, even careful things, even loving things, even things held with both hands, had created a distance I hadn't been able to name for over a year. That I had spent 14 months carrying a weight I couldn't identify, and that it had made me smaller. And that coming back from that kind of small is slow work. That next time, and I said that with intention, because I meant it as a certainty and not a question, he needed to trust that I could hold fragile things without dropping them. That I had been holding fragile things my entire life. It was, in fact, most of what I did for a living. He said, "You're right, I should have trusted you sooner, I'm sorry." He didn't elaborate or justify or build a case. He just took it in. That was all I needed from him in that moment. Agnes woke up and asked if anyone wanted tea. My husband said yes, I said yes. She called for the care aide with the authority of someone who had spent decades being the most competent person in a room. And 3 cups arrived on a tray with a plate of arrowroot biscuits. And the 4 of us, 3 of us, and one sleeping in the chair by the window, spent another hour in that warm, slightly overheated room in Dunmore Falls, Ontario in January. We went back 4 more times before she passed. In April, 3 weeks before our anniversary, her niece called in the morning to tell us Agnes had gone quietly, before breakfast, in her sleep. She had been talking the day before about a drive through the bush in early spring, about roads that were barely roads, about a house that smelled like wood smoke, about a morning when the sky was just beginning to lighten, and a man stood at a window and said something she had written down, because it deserved to exist outside of just one moment. My husband gave me something for our anniversary. Not the bound journal he'd originally planned. He said it felt different now, after everything, to present it as a sealed and finished thing. Instead, he gave me a single page, the entry from Agnes's midwife's journal, which she had let him photograph on his second visit, framed simply in dark wood. Agnes's handwriting, my father's words. The date at the top, the night I was born. It hangs on the wall in our bedroom. Some mornings I read it before I get up. Some mornings I just look at it. I still have the bus ticket from Dunmore Falls in the pocket of a cardigan I wear to work. There's no practical reason to keep it. But I find that I'm not ready to throw it away yet. It marks the point before I understood, before the story became what it turned out to be. And I want to remember what that felt like, the weight of not knowing, so I can understand the full distance between where I was standing in November and where I stand now. My father grew up in a house where nothing that mattered was ever said. He spent 31 years trying to do it differently, in the only ways he knew how. He wasn't always good at it. The glass was there most of the time. But Agnes held his words in a journal for 34 years, and my husband drove 90 minutes in the winter to go and collect them. And one afternoon in January, I sat in a room in a long-term care facility, in a town I'd never heard of, and learned that my father had stood at a window in the dark and said he was going to spend his whole life trying to love his daughter right. He spent 31 years trying. He got it right more than he knew.